and welcome back to the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast. My name is John Rainier, the history teacher, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mark Prosser, the climate researcher. So we've got lined up for you a slightly different episode today. Throughout our podcast series, we talk about the Ziggurat of climate denial quite a lot. It's even our logo and our thumbnail for the podcast. So what we thought we'd do this week is we'd make a standalone episode to explain what the Ziggurat actually is for anyone who needs a refresher or to brush up or is coming in partway through the podcast, has listened to a few of our episodes and don't know what we're talking about.
I'm going to start off with 7 examples of climate denial arguments you might hear or encounter out there in the wild. They're not in any particular order, but I'm just going to sort of reel them off. So, 1. People only talk about the negatives of climate change, but the positives will outweigh the negatives. For example, vineyards are now possible in the UK when they weren't many years ago. 2. I don't know why you're so worried about climate change. Technology will get us out of this mess. 3. Global temperatures aren't even changing. It's all a lie. 4. Solving climate change is simply going to cost too much money. 5. The changes are minuscule and will be barely noticeable. 6. It's got nothing to do with man-made greenhouse gases like CO2. It's the sun that's changing the temperatures. 7. There's nothing we can do about it anyway. We might as well just sit back. So do you think those 7 skeptical points have anything in common, John?
Well, I guess the fact that they all kind of interlink between each other, they all kind of build on each other. So if you kind of believe in one, you may be more likely to believe the next one. Or if you argue one and it gets denied, then it can kind of lead into the next one quite easily, I guess. Yeah,
that's true. And also you get people who will use several of them, not just the one. But I guess something that for me links them all together quite nicely is the fact that no matter what you're arguing, and they are quite different examples from each other, so they're like examples of each level of the Ziggurat, but something which links them all together is that ultimately we shouldn't have to do anything about climate change. So in one way or another, they're kind of like linked to that thesis. So rather than we've got a huge problem, we've got to do something about it, all of these arguments here are basically saying we don't need to do anything about it, ultimately. And so that, for me, is the sort of the central theme of climate change denial. Yeah, so to start off with, I think we mentioned from time to time in the series about a list of 219 climate denial arguments on the website Skeptical Science. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Now, 219 arguments is enough to make my head spin, let alone the head of a casual debunker of climate change denial. So we need a solution to help us get a grip. And the solution that has worked for me is the denial ziggurat. I typically use the denial ziggurat to diagnose the type of climate denial or skepticism I am dealing with when confronted by a skeptical comment or argument. If I diagnose it correctly, I stand a much better chance of being able to respond to it more precisely and more convincingly, much like a doctor can better deal with an illness when they correctly diagnose it in the first place. For example, I once met up with an old teacher of mine who turned out to be climate skeptical. After a long discussion with her, it turned out that the source of her skepticism was the fact that the Earth was huge, and we are, despite our numbers, but tiny, tiny beings. How could we, a tiny thing, impact something so big as the Earth? So what I did was to show her the following diagram. And you have the diagram in front of you, don't you, John?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes.
The diagram contains 2 versions of the Earth, both about the size of a basketball. The one on the left is without oceans, the dry Earth. And then the one next to it on the right has oceans on it, the wet Earth. So sitting on top of the dry Earth is a blue marble-sized object, which is the size the entire oceans would have if brought together and rolled up into a sphere. It's surprisingly small. It's just about big enough to sit comfortably on top of mainland Europe, but is far smaller than you'd think, especially when compared to the size of the basketball it's on top of, or the Earth that's the size of a basketball. On the wet Earth next door is another small but slightly larger sphere, which represents the size the entire atmosphere would have if, again, it was brought together, compressed to the pressure that we experience it at ground level. So basically, needless to say, this one image was kind of key to changing her perception of how big the Earth really is. Or at least the atmosphere and ocean weren't as big as she thought they were. Did I miss anything out in describing the image, John? Or?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, good. So yeah, like John says, we'll put those in the show notes.
So essentially, the ziggurat in our podcast logo represents the 7 common stages of climate denial. They all build upon one another, with the bottom level of the ziggurat being the most basic and most extreme form of climate denial. Mark will be explaining the inspiration for the ziggurat later in the episode. So Mark, could you explain the 7 levels for us?
Okay, so moving on to the ziggurat, it's composed of 6 levels. The first 2, the bottom 2, are somewhat scientific in nature. At the very bottom level, we have the world may not be warming, followed by, on the level immediately upwards, number 2. But if it is warming, this is probably due to natural variation in the Earth's climate. So can you spell out for us, John, what the difference is between levels 1 and 2 is?
I guess the difference is to do with acknowledging that global warming is happening. So level 1 flat out denies it's just not happening at all, going against all the science to the contrary. Whereas the second one is okay, but it's part of the natural cycles of global warming.
Exactly. Yeah. Bang on. So if someone is coming at you with the first 2 levels, then that is considered hardcore science denial, as nearly every single scientist in the field of climate science would sign up to the fact that 1, the Earth is warming, and 2, this warming is mostly due to human-caused greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, like methane. Something like 97 or 99+% of published climate scientists would agree with this. There have been studies on climate scientists to see what they actually think. Now, this level of agreement is about as good as you ever get in the scientific community. So even with, like things in sort of science's past that pretty much are viewed as fact, like, for example, evolution, I believe if you look at the sort of scientific consensus for that, you don't get to 100%. So you're never going to get to 100%. So with the denial ziggurat, when you get to the upper levels 5 and 6, you'll notice the character of the denial shifts from hardcore science denial to more of a kind of political denial. But first, we need to hit the 2 intermediate layers, 3 and 4. Level 3. But if this is not the case, if it is not due to natural variation, the amount of warming is probably not significant. So, John, by stage 3, what is the skeptic accepting and what are they not accepting, bearing in mind levels 1 and 2?
So it's a key break from levels 1 and 2 because they're actually accepting that global warming, that climate change is occurring, but they're making the point that it's minor, it's insignificant, it's not something to be worrying about.
Sure. And is there anything else that they're accepting at this point? Okay, so the
warming itself.
Yeah. So they're accepting that the warming is happening, but they're also accepting that it is us. It is human caused.
Right.
Yeah. So by this point, you've got those two in the bag. So they've sort of slightly moved off, well, debatably hardcore denial, as it were. But they believe the Earth is warming, and they believe that it is human caused. Well, I say that, maybe they don't. It depends on the particular person you're encountering. But you do get people who accept those 2 points, but they're like, it's just not going to be significant. I say, they've moved off hardcore denial, but it is hardcore science denial, but it is pretty in denial of science, in my opinion, still, because the idea that the warming will be insignificant seems to fly in the face of everything being predicted over the rest of this century by numerous climate models around the world. So we're probably on track for a plus 3 degrees centigrade change by 2100. For US listeners, that's a plus 5.5 degree Fahrenheit. And by plus, what I'm comparing that to is 1850, the pre-industrial period. So 3 degrees centigrade warmer than that by 2100. Well, that's our best guess according to the models. And that is going to be a flippin' enormous change. So even now, we're at plus 1.1 or plus 1.2 degrees centigrade, 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. There is a lot of suffering going on across the globe, especially this year, as well as we have, on top of that, we have an El Nino, which is making things even hotter. So there is actually a scientific discussion to be had around something called the climate sensitivity. And so I think in maybe episode 1, I sort of mentioned that in the pre-industrial period, we had an atmospheric concentration of 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So that's what it was. Today in the 2020s, that's 50% higher. So that's 420 parts per million. But this thing called the climate sensitivity, it's basically asking if we double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so we take it from 280 parts per million in the pre-industrial to 560 parts per million, what will that mean in terms of the eventual temperature rise? It's a little bit complicated because if we were to suddenly double the amount of carbon dioxide, it takes a long time, or it takes maybe a decade or 2 decades for the warming to come. So it's not instantaneous. You don't instantaneously. The world is a big, as we were previously saying, the world is a big entity and it has oceans and it takes a long time for these to warm up. But eventually, how much temperature change will this mean? And the best guess of scientists is that it means about 3 degrees of temperature change. But crucially, the models don't all agree. It's very unlikely to be below 2 degrees, given what we've seen already. But it could also be a lot higher than 3 degrees. If we're really unlucky, it could be like 4 degrees or more than 4 degrees. So essentially, but the average guess is about 3 degrees. And 3 degrees in itself is pretty mind-boggling. It's nowhere near as bad as 4 degrees. But it's, you're not going to fail to notice 3 degrees of warming, and it's going to cause all sorts of upsets for the whole world. So this is 3 degrees is what would happen if we did what we did up till now, but we didn't really do anything else. So maybe we can get by 2100 the amount of warming down even further if we make a lot of effort. But yeah, so 3 degrees is currently what we.
So when you say do what we've done, are you saying continue to use fossil fuels and everything like that at the current rate we are, or are you saying that actually just by carrying on at the rate we are, that will cause a continued increase?
That's a good question, and I was vague. What they're saying is, yeah, I don't quite know how they put it into the models, but essentially, we've made some progress in terms of decarbonizing the global economy, and maybe this, so at the moment we're building wind turbines and solar, this at the rate that we're doing now, but this rate didn't increase or something like that, then we're on track for a 3-degree world. Okay. And we brought that down. So it's important to be optimistic about this. So we've brought that down from 4 degrees potentially. So we have taken a bite out of the problem, but 3 degrees is still gnarly, and we need to bring that down as much as possible. And maybe if we're very lucky, we can bring it down below 2 degrees.
Okay.
But it's gonna take a lot of effort to bring it down. Yeah, does that answer your question, or have I danced around it?
No, that does, yeah.
But yeah, it's a good question. Thanks for picking me up on that. Yeah, so essentially, the idea that this change is going to be insignificant is just like laughable, basically. So moving on to the 4th level of the Ziggurat, if it is significant, we're talking about the warming, the benefits should outweigh the disadvantages. Cool. So John, the 3 things that they're accepting here potentially in the Ziggurat methodology, but what are they not accepting?
They're accepting that climate change is happening, and they're accepting that actually climate change is going to have a significant impact on the world's climate. But what they're refusing to accept is that, again, that those impacts should be anything to worry about. It's that almost kind of like kind of head in the sand approach of like, yeah, but human beings are great. We'll sort this. It's fine. We'll get through this, and it's not going to bother us. Which is probably again one of those things that those of us in the northern hemisphere, in those parts of the Western world that are not yet experiencing the major impacts of climate change, are in a very fortuitous position to be able to say right now, which probably lends credence to that argument, but that in the foreseeable future won't be the case.
Yes, certainly agree with everything you said there. I mean, so you can see, like I said before, you can see that as these arguments are made, it's essentially the thing that you then, I guess the corollary of what's being said is, so we don't need to do anything about it. If the positives are going to outweigh the negatives, maybe it's not such a big deal. Maybe we could just let it happen, kind of thing. So that's what I meant about the Ziggurat. Ultimately, it leads to basically inaction on the problem.
Yeah.
So very good on your answer there. Was there anything else? So you said that they accept that the Earth is warming. They accept that it will be significant. But was there anything else they accept?
They accept that there are going to be some disadvantages.
True, but is there anything? So Ziggurat level 2?
So that's the one about it being natural, is it?
Yes. Yeah. So with the Ziggurat level 2, it's essentially saying, it's not human-caused greenhouse gases. It's just some natural cycle. It's got nothing to do with us. So I agree it's changing, but it's not us. So I guess this is the one that in your case, it's maybe it slips your mind, but it's like, number 1, it's happening. It's not happening. Number 2, it's not us. 3, it's insignificant. Yeah. So essentially, it's just the number 2.
Okay.
Great. So now, while it is true that some places further north in the globe may benefit from lower degrees of warming, the vast majority of places will suffer. And this ratio of suffering to benefiting climbs the higher the global temperatures go. I will put a document in the show notes that explains what happens to the world at +1 degrees of warming, +2 degrees, +3 degrees, all the way up to +6 degrees. At higher levels of warming, large parts of India could become too hot for humans to physically survive. Where will Nepal get its water from once the mountain glaciers that supply it melt away completely? You aren't going to get benefits from climate change big enough to offset those types of negative changes. I don't think many people will be surprised to hear that a lot of the denial that you get on climate change comes one way or another from the fossil fuel industry that are in large part a cause of this problem. So moving on to level 5 of the Ziggurat, level 5, but if they don't, and here they're talking about positives outweighing the negatives, then technology should be able to solve problems as they arise. What do you think's the problem with this type of argument, John? Any thoughts? Or
I think it mainly just feeds a lot of complacency. So the idea that saying that no matter how bad we make it, we are going to be able to fix it. You know, it's admirable to be that positive about it, but it also is just massively in denial of how serious the impacts can be and how avoidable they are. It's more about focusing on treating the symptom rather than the cause. And to date, the technology doesn't currently exist that will solve all those problems. Plus also the fact that a lot of the areas, you know, we may have the technology, but as we've seen throughout history, just having the technology doesn't mean that everybody equally benefits from it. And those areas in the world that we're seeing that are being hit hardest at the moment are those that actually don't currently have the infrastructure in place to deal with the situation as it currently is, let alone where it's going to get to in the foreseeable future.
Yes, I'd sign off on a lot of that. One of the really frustrating things about climate change and our attempts to deal with the problem is that we do have the technology to solve the problem. Okay. Yeah, like basically in sort of all parts of the economy, technology exists now that could help us completely solve the problem. The annoying thing is that it's too expensive, basically. Right. So you have a solution. For example, you have carbon dioxide scrubbers that you could put at the top of coal power stations. So at the plume, or whatever you call it, like the chimney where the waste gas goes out, you could have something which could capture the carbon dioxide. You could then put the carbon dioxide under the ground in places where it won't escape. At least in theory, it won't escape. But yeah, to do so would mean that the cost of energy would go up. And so companies don't want to do it, basically. Yeah. So quite often it boils down to it's too expensive. So that's the really frustrating thing. It's not like we're waiting for some crazy technology to be invented. I mean, so there's a sort of another form of capturing carbon dioxide where it's just it kind of typically looks like a fan, and you can put them anywhere in the atmosphere, and then they basically just suck out the carbon dioxide that's in the air. But so a lot of people are banking on this as a sort of solution, but the problem is that it's just really expensive to cap. It can be done, but it costs still way too much. And the idea that we're going to be able to, I mean, some people say we're going to overshoot the amount of warming we want, but this is okay because this technology can jump in. And it's well, hang on, it might always be very expensive to do this, and so it's a bit wishful thinking that we can kind of rely on it. But yeah. So what other points have I got here? Yeah, also just, this kind of idea that the economy will create the technology and that will solve the problem. The amount of innovation in relation to climate change has been a bit slow in the past, typically. It's basically like all this pressure from like populations, from government, from industry. All of this makes stuff on climate change happen. So it's definitely not about sitting back on your ass and hoping that someone else will fix the problem. The more of that we do, the less things will happen. So yeah. And also just in general, like, the whole, it's not just about energy. There's things like, the amount of like meat we eat, the whole of humanity eats, and some of these things, I mean, so there have been sort of like substitute meats, things like that, which mean you can eat like pretty decent tasting stuff that can sort of substitute for meat, which has far fewer emissions associated with it. But just the idea that we can just sort of like live our like high consumptive lifestyle, and like as people in China and India become more affluent, then they too can have our kind of high consumptive lifestyle, and everything will be okay. It's, I think there's going to be an element of maybe we need to like live a little bit more, in line with what sort of the planet requires of us. There is an awful lot of us, and we can't all consume like Westerner lifestyles if we.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I might have mentioned it before on the podcast, but my wife and I are vegan, and like for me personally, the environmental impact of consuming meat was one of the main reasons why I became vegan. One of the arguments that's always thrown at vegans is, oh yeah, but soy has one of the biggest impacts on the environment, and that's a vegan food. But the vast majority of soy that is produced in the world goes to animal feed.
Yeah, exactly.
If we weren't consuming meat, then there would be significantly less soy being produced across the world.
Yeah, I get really annoyed when people use that argument because it's so fucking misplaced. Oops, I said yeah. Yeah.
It's all right. Yeah. This is an adult content podcast.
Yeah, we have a rating on it, do we, or something like that, so that no kiddies can hear our climate change doomism.
One F-bomb makes it a 12, doesn't it? That's fine.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. So we've still got the teenagers allowed to listen. Cool. Yeah. So okay. So basically, this idea that something other than us is going to deal with the problem, I think, is flawed. Okay. Then finally, you have level 6 of the Ziggurat, which I split into 2. So the second half of this was kind of my addition. So this whole poem of the Ziggurat wasn't mine to start with. I nicked it from someone. Don't know who originally wrote it, but I've sort of added on a sort of a second half. But before we do the second bit of the last level, level 6. But if we can't solve the problem with technology, we shouldn't wreck the economy to fix the problem. What's wrong with this one, John?
Well, I think for me, this is just something that just results in, so let's just not do anything. And it's also incredibly short-term thinking, because I'm pretty certain that plus 3 degrees of climate change is going to so significantly alter the world economy and the ability for certain countries' economies to function full stop, that not doing anything will wreck the economy far more than having the short-term, short-sighted approach of, oh, let's just carry on as we are, because otherwise it'll affect the economy now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I guess if I'm being a little bit kind to this one, there is a kernel of truth in it. So it's going to be economically challenging to convert the world economy into a sort of sustainable economy. But like you say, like the costs associated with climate change could be limitless. Like it's. Yeah, so and it's like as you go from like 1 degree to 2 degrees, the costs ramp up enormously. But that amount of increase, so when you go from 2 degrees to 3 degrees, it's not the same amount of increase in the amount it's going to cost us. It's sort of exponential, like in terms of how much it's going to cost. So there's that point. And also, like, I think there was a few years ago now, I can't remember how long ago, there was something called the Stern Review, which was like a kind of an economic review of how much is it going to cost to deal with climate change. And I think their conclusion was that it's going to cost, the amount it's going to cost to deal with climate change is going to be trivial when compared to the amount that climate change is going to cost us if we do nothing. And so basically it made the case that it is 100% economically sensible to be dealing with this. Yeah. But the annoying thing is, the longer you leave it, the more expensive it becomes. I mean, there are questions at the moment, about who's going to pay, because there are costs associated with, like making your house sort of green, or changing your car. You might have a car already, you've got to then pay to get a car that's electric or something like this. And this is going to, so this means that there is going to be a cost. And there's a question about how much governments should be subsidizing, people. And so there are going to be costs. It's just kind of annoying. It's kind of like this barrier that we have to jump over. And if we can do that, then we'll save ourselves a bundle of costs down the line. But if we don't do anything, I mean, there's just a very, very scary bill on its way. And so this idea that you're doing the economically sensible thing by not doing anything is just, like you say, John, short-sighted. And just generally, this idea. So, like, the way I see it is, the economy as a sort of an abstract entity sits on top of the environment. The environment is its foundation. We have a global economy that sort of functions because of certain, because of the environment it's in. If it's the case that you get sort of huge amounts of migration, or you get wars starting over resources that have been put under pressure by climate change, like, you can say goodbye to parts of the global economy. I just think that people, just in their mind, they become so detached from, like, the environment, that they sort of think that, the environment is just something, it's like an optional extra or something. It doesn't really concern us. And that's just fundamentally the wrong way to think about it, because we depend. I mean, like, one of the things I often say is, like, space, the bigger environment in which we're in is an environment that's, like, literally hostile to life. And you go into space without a spacesuit. You've got like 30 seconds before you die.
As long as that. Wow. Okay.
I mean, it's actually longer than you think. So it's not quite the case of, I think a teacher once said at our school that if you were to be exposed to space, you'd instantly turn inside out. It looks like she might have been wrong.
Okay.
But you don't instantly turn inside out. But it's various unpleasant things happen to you. And so we live in this. It's like a ginormous spaceship that keeps us alive. It produces oxygen, water for us, food. It's like a life support machine. And without that life support machine, we wouldn't stay alive. So just the environment is crucial to us. And we can't have big things go wrong with it. So anyways, I think sometimes it's just, people just don't realize, but yeah. Okay, so here's my alternative to level 6. So instead of it being about wrecking the economy, but if we can't solve the problems with technology, the problem is too big for us to solve. We're doomed. So we might as well just put our feet up and enjoy ourselves. What do you think, John? Should we just put our feet up and enjoy ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, Well, it's frustrating, really. I think with this one, the fact that so many of them have kind of fundamentally been either about refusing to accept responsibility. So it's not to do with humans. We didn't do it. It's not our fault. Through to, oh, but humans are great, so we can fix anything. Through to, well, if we can't, doesn't matter. And yeah, it's, for me personally, it just goes against so many personal values that I have about, personal responsibility and doing things to help others, that I find it a very frustrating one.
Yeah, I hear you there. It is massively frustrating, and it's going to be hugely annoying, because I reckon what will happen is all the people who up till now said it's not happening will suddenly en masse change their tune to, well, we can't really do anything about it. So it's going to be the same group of people, or
when we could have done something about it sooner.
Yeah, exactly. And what's even more sinister is there's a great series on YouTube, which I probably talk about from time to time, called Kurzgesagt. And I'll put it in the show notes. But in one of their videos, they make the argument that the fossil fuel industry, maybe going on into the future, one thing that they might do is try to convince us that the problem is too big to solve one way or another, too expensive, or just, we've lost control of the reins to do anything about it now. It's too late. And the goal is to depress us as much as possible so that we stop putting pressure. So we stop thinking about it, and we stop putting pressure on governments to get to net zero, etc.
To be honest, I think I see little hints of that beginning already. This mentality of, we've just got to learn to live with things as they currently are. And I can see that repeating at each level of climate change. It's like, well, the temperature has increased to this, so we've just got to learn to live with the temperature at this.
Yeah, maybe it is already sort of slightly out there. I don't think it's out there in a major way yet, but I mean, if people are thinking we've just got to learn, I mean, we have to adapt to. Everyone is going to have to adapt to whatever comes their way. But if they're thinking that this is as bad as it's going to get, and it's not going to get any worse, then they've got another thing coming, because every step up is, it just gets worse and worse. So yeah, very frustrating. So there you have it. That's the Ziggurat in all its 6-level glory. Once you know what level of the denial Ziggurat you are dealing with, what the person is accepting and they're not accepting, then you can develop a much better response to what they're saying, or for the benefit of people who are listening to you discuss climate change with this person. The Ziggurat will also help John and I structure this podcast series. We'll start at the foundational level and make our way slowly to the top as the series progresses.
Okay, so I guess one final question for today, Mark. Where did your idea for the Ziggurat come from?
Yeah, so I guess it's a little bit like a poem, isn't it? The world may not be warming, but if it is, the changes are probably natural, but if they aren't, it won't be significant. But if they are, the positives will outweigh the benefits, and so on and so forth. It's kind of a bit like a poem. And so I don't know who originally, it probably would be a trivial Google search, which I probably should have done before this episode, to see if there's someone I can attribute this original poem to. But I just find it really helpful. So it wasn't my invention. I did tack on the alternative level 6 about, so we're all doomed and we might as well not do anything, because I think that one will become increasingly prominent as time goes on. So the Ziggurat part of it, so the sort of the stepped pyramid, comes from my old university, the University of East Anglia, where there are a number of student dorms right in the middle of campus that are shaped as ziggurats. So they're sort of, as far as UEA goes, they're kind of quite often you see pictures of UEA, you see pictures of the stepped ziggurats. So they're kind of iconic for the University of East Anglia. And so I basically merged these two ideas at some point down the line. Can't remember where or how, but yeah, so that's where it came from.
Cool. So that's it for this week. Thank you for listening. You can find a link to all of the materials we've referenced in this episode in our show notes. Following on from our first episode, our next episode is going to continue to myth bust the arguments claiming that global warming is not happening. If you want to know more about the Countering Climate Skepticism podcast, check out our website at ccspod.podbean.com. So that's ccspod.podbean.com. If you've enjoyed the episode and would like to know to support the show further, you can leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it is now known. So goodbye from me, John Rainier.
And goodbye from me, Mark Prosser.